In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a class and explain what a class is and why we want to use them and what needs to go into one. But a class is just the blueprint for an object, or you can think of it as a template or a cookie cutter that you're going to use to make multiple cookies. Just like in GameMaker, we could make objects, and then we would use the light bulb piece, the create instance piece, to make instances of that object. That's what a class file is. It is just the definition for an object that we can make none of or as many of as we want. So in this project, I'm just going to make a little Space Invader that runs across the screen, and I have added resources for my background image and a Space Invader and two little images of a Space Invader. So that's what we're going to use here. Now, let's just explain what's going on. I have a picture box here with this background image set. I have a timer, and the timer is running, and the interval is set to something very small. And when the timer ticks, it tells the picture box to refresh itself. So in here, this is where we're going to draw the Space Invaders. Space Invader, depending on how many we have. Maybe we'll have more than one. Maybe we'll like Bob Ross this thing and have like lots of happy little Space Invaders. So that's our little animation mechanism right there. We've got this timer that's driving the picture box. The picture box's paint function in there. That's where we're going to draw. So now we could, Visual Studio does not seem to like it now when you create more than one class in the same file in a Windows Form application. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go over to our project and right click and come down here and select add. And if we come down here to these options, you'll see that there's an option for adding a class. So what this is going to do is add another file to our project where we can define our Space Invader object. So let's do that. So right click, add class. And I'm going to call this maybe I'll call it Invader or something. Invader. Doesn't really matter what you call the file. Okay, there you go. So now notice our project namespace is still the same in this file, but now we have a class called Invader. So this is where we are going to define a Space Invader. Definition for a Space Invader. There we go. Okay. Now, what does a Space Invader have? Like when you design a class, you have to think about what does this object need data-wise, and what does it need to do like function-wise? Like you have to come up with like the variables for this particular object and the functions that are the things that this object does. So when you make a class, you have to kind of think about what does this object need to know and what does it need to do. And I'm going to go back to the vending machine analogy here that I've used before, where you have the vending machine has stuff that's private. You can't go in and take out all the flaming hot Cheetos, and you can't reach in and get out any dollar bills that are in the machine. That's all private. But there is a mechanism for interacting with the vending machine, right? That's the keypad and the little credit card thing. So you could think of an object having an interface to it, but it also has some stuff that's kind of walled off from the outside world that you don't necessarily want people to mess with. But fundamentally, you want to think when you design an object, what does this object need to know and what does it need to do? Because that's your data and those are your functions. So a Space Invader is going to have a coordinate on the screen, right? So let's give it a variable called X. Let's give it a variable called Y. And I don't know, let's give it a variable called frame, which is like which one of its pictures it's drawing. And when we define these, let's set them to 0. Doesn't really, just a good habit to get into. When you make your variables, give them some sort of default value. If you don't give them a value, they get set to 0 anyway, but it's just kind of good style. All right, so what we've done here is we have defined a Space Invader that has a variable called X in it, a variable called Y in it, and a variable called frame in it. And I'll put a note here, like which image to display. Now, if I make 100 Space Invaders, each one of them will have an X and a Y and a variable called frame. These are class variables. They go inside the class, and every instance of this class, I can make 100 of them. They each have their own copy of X, Y, and frame. All right, cool. Now, what do we need to do function-wise? Like, what does this invader need to be? Oh, you know what? Maybe there's something else. Maybe there's like how far the invader moves every step or something. Let's make a variable called step size. I'm going to make it all caps just so we know that it's a constant. And I'll call it like 20 or something. How far to step, left or right? Left, right, or maybe even down too. I don't know. We'll figure this out. We're kind of Bob Rossing this. All right. Now, if this isn't supposed to change, if like you're not supposed to be able to modify this, what I'm going to do is make it const. Const means that you can't accidentally change step size. If you don't make it const, somebody might accidentally change it. It's not really going to happen in this example. No, it's not. But if you want to define something that like you can't accidentally change, you can make it const. Right. Now we know about that. Now, in order for this class to be useful for us, it has to have a constructor. We have to have a way of making a space invader. And the way to make a constructor for your class is to type CTOR and hit tab twice. And Visual Studio will make a constructor for you. It is a special function that has the same name as the class. And notice there's no return type here. A constructor is implicitly returns you the type of object. Like the constructor for an invader implicitly returns you an invader object. We don't need to like specify what we're returning here. That's just how people designed the language. All right, so is this constructor particularly useful? No, not really, not by itself. Now, what if we wanted to make a constructor that took two parameters, like where the invader is on the screen? We can make another constructor, and it's very common to have multiple types of constructors or more than one constructor. So let's type CTOR and hit tab twice again. There we go. And now we've got another constructor for an invader. Now the trick here is that if you can have two constructors or two functions with the same name, that is fine, but the parameter list has to be different. So let's say this constructor is going to have two parameters, where this thing is on the screen. And maybe I'll call it just for clarity, I'm going to call this X chord and Y chord, like where the thing is on the screen. All right, now inside my constructor, what I'm going to do is set this X and Y equal to these values. And what that'll allow me to do is make an invader at a particular location on the screen. So I'll say X equals X chord. So what I'm doing is I'm setting this invader's X coordinate to whatever is passed in here as the parameter. Y equals Y chord. There we go. All right. So now I have a way of creating a space invader. So when I create a space invader, at some point I'm going to say, invader I equals new invader, and I can either give it the no argument constructor, in which case I'll end up with 0, 0, 0, or I can use this constructor and pass in two numbers, and it would put an invader at that point on the screen. So maybe, now what does an invader need to do? Maybe it's got a function for moving left or right. So maybe I'll make a function here called move left. Move left. There we go. Now, when an invader moves left, like our game is going to be telling this invader to move left. So in order for our game, our form, to be able to use this function, we have to make it public. If we don't, it's assumed to be private. And then we won't be able to use it, because if it's private, then it's walled off from the outside world and we're not supposed to use it. Now, what does the move left function do? Well, let's say it's going to move this thing X equals X minus step size. There we go. So what this will do is move the invader a little bit to the left. Now let's just copy this, and we'll have one called move right. And we'll add the step size there. And maybe we have a function called drop down. Now these functions all need to be public if they're going to be used by our form. Y equals Y plus step size. There we go. And we also need, if we're going to actually see this invader on the screen, we need a draw function. Void draw. Okay. Now, what is the draw function going to take as a parameter? Well, it needs a canvas to draw itself on, and the function needs to be public. Public. Okay. Let's make it take a graphics object. Graphics is like it's like a canvas in Java, or it is something that we can paint on. So let's, that actually worked. Okay. Now in here, let's draw the invader on the screen. So we'll say if frame is equal to 0. Oh, you know what? Here, rather than just writing it out longhand, I'm just going to do if tab tab. If tab tab. There we go. Else tab tab. There we go. Now I can't accidentally mess this up. The frame is equal to 0. Then I'm going to do this. Frame equals 1. Otherwise, frame was equal to 1. So now I'm going to... Oh, I got that backwards. If frame is equal to 0, now it's 1. Otherwise, frame is equal to 0. I'm just making a variable that toggles between 0 and 1. And then in here, what I'm going to do is draw the invader on the screen. So the graphics object here, G, that is coming in as a parameter, has a draw image function built into it. And if you didn't know what was in that parameter, just hit the dot operator, and you'll see a list of all the stuff that's built into that. There's a lot of stuff. Draw image, okay. And now let's give it properties dot resources dot invader big 0 and invader big 1. Now, why is it griping at me? No overload. Oh, because I have to give it a coordinate. Aha, right. So how did I figure that out? Because if I hover over it, it tells me what arguments this thing needs. There's 30 different ways to call this function. Oh my God. But you have to give it, there it is, an image and an X and a Y. So let's give it this invader's X coordinate and this invader's Y coordinate. There we go. Cool. All right. So now we have the definition for a space invader. It has an X variable, a Y variable, a frame variable, a step size variable. Now, these are private. I didn't put public in front of them, so they are assumed to be private. Like the form can't manually change the coordinate of an invader. It has to use the move left, move right, or drop down function, right? These public functions are our interface. They're the way we interact with this object. All right, so let's now actually go make an invader. So all we've done now is we've defined a space invader, but we haven't actually made any of them. So let's go back to our form, and I will make a space invader here. See, now I can say invader I'll call it invader lowercase. Or I'll call it I. Yeah, no, I'll call it lower invader. There you go. That's a much more descriptive name. Equals new. Now, when I call my space invader, notice that it says you have one of two constructors available, and it shows me I have the no argument constructor available, or I have the one that takes 2 parameters. So let me put this guy at 50-50 on the screen. There we go. And then in my draw function, I will call that space invader's draw. Invader.draw, and I have to give it the graphics object to draw itself on. I have to say, hey, invader, go draw yourself, and here's the canvas to draw yourself on. Where is the canvas? It is hiding in this paint event args thing called E. E has got the graphics object to draw itself on. So what I'm doing here is I'm passing the canvas into the space invader, and the space invader is going to draw itself. The form doesn't know where the invader is on the screen. It doesn't know what image to use. That's the job of the space invader. The space invader knows how to manage its own state. The game does not need to take care of that, right? So that's this idea of a class needs to have the data to keep track of what it's supposed to be doing, and it has to have the public functions for other objects to be able to interact with it. So let's run this and hope that it works. And it did, and the space invader is totally spazzing out, and it's also drawn right in the sun. So you can see its legs are wiggling real fast. That is not what I wanted. Let's go modify that a little bit. But it actually did work. So first of all, let's make this space invader over 200 pixels and run it again and see what that looks like. There we go. There's our space invader. Okay, so let's go back to our invader. This is, where's our invader? There we go. You know what? Interesting. Let's not change. I'm not going to change the frame here. Does it matter? Does it really matter? No. Yeah, because the invader is standing still. All right. Here, let's make this interesting. I'm going to make a function called next frame, void next frame of the animation. Notice it is I have not made it public. It is a private function. So the form can't call this function. But in here, I'm going to put my thing about if frame is 0, then set frame to 1. Otherwise, set frame to 0. So that's going to toggle the frame here. And it's feeding time at the right household. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I really only want to go to the next frame after I've moved. So down here, what I'll do is I'll call the next frame function after I've moved left or right or dropped down. There we go. All right. Okay, so just to recap what I did there, the draw function is looking at what frame it's supposed to draw, and it's picking which image to draw based on that. And I've made a function here that just toggles the frame. It says if the frame is 0, make it 1, otherwise make it 0. So here, I'll even put a comment in here. What I did was I hit the slash 3 times. Here, let me delete that and show you again. 1, 2, 3, boom. And it does that automatically. Toggles which image to draw, or flips which image to draw. How about that? Now, remember, this is private. So if I'm in the form here and I try to do something like invader.flip, or was it next frame? See, I can't call it. I don't even see it in the list of functions here because it's private. If I make it public, then I'll be able to use it. Now, in the timer tick function here, why don't I tell the invader to move left? There you go. Now let's run it and see what it does. Oh, he ran right off the screen. Okay. So maybe my step size is a little too big, maybe. Or I need a different type of counter here. This was not really meant to be a well thought out game. It was more, there you go. So he ran right off the screen. Okay, so let's now, keeping with that, let's make, let's go back to our invader here. And maybe we'll add another public function. And maybe this will tell us whether we've hit the left edge or not. Bool. We'll make it a bool. So it'll return true or false, hit left edge. And maybe we give it the left edge. We say, like, we give it a number and it's like, hey, are you left of that? So it will say if the x coordinate of the invader is less than or equal to the left edge, return true. Or otherwise else tab, return false. Now I can actually condense this. I could just, because this is either going to be true or false, right? So I could just return that. I can actually just say return this. Return x is less than the left edge. And we could also make one for the right edge. Hit right edge if the x is greater than or equal to the right edge. Oh, dogs. I don't know if you can hear them barking right now, but they are annoying for sure. There we go. Okay. So, interesting. Now, how am I going to use this? Well, okay. So before, I spelled right edge wrong there. So we've got our invader that can move left, move right, move down, and we can ask it questions like, hey, did you hit the left edge? Did you hit the right edge? And so now we can kind of control this thing. So just for fun now, I'm going to go back to the form. Um, excuse me. Maybe I'll make a variable called direction here. Um, uh, Nuts. Okay. How am I going to do this? Constant. I'll define some constants. Left is 0. Constant right equals 1. This is just like the stoplight. And then I'll make a variable called direction, which is which way the invaders are moving. There you go. Okay. So in here, I could say if the direction is equal to left, move the invader left. Otherwise, else if, well, actually, it's either going to be one or the other, right? Else if, move the invader to the right. Okay. But now, let's say, how do I know if the invader hit the left edge, right? I could say if invader, oh nuts, dot hit left edge, and then I can drop in some number, like I'll say 25. Like it has to be the left edge of the screen is 25. Then I'll say invader dot drop down. It's probably going to move wonky here, but that's okay because this is just drop down. And then let's set our direction equal to right. There we go. So we hit the left edge, drop down, and now it changed our direction. Okay, and then let's do the same thing here. If the invader hit the, now how do we figure out like what the right edge is? Maybe we say picture box 1 dot width minus 25 or something. Give ourselves a margin of, we'll use the control's actual size to figure out what the left edge is. Drop down and then direction equals left. So let's run this and see what it does. So the takeaway here is when you are making one of these classes, you have to define what are the private variables, what data does this thing need to have, and what are the public functions that you need to have in this object that allow outside objects to interact with it. And you may have private functions like this that do some housekeeping for you, but collectively that is what you have in a class. You have some data, you have, and you've got to have your constructors so you can make the object, and you've got public functions that allow you to interact with the object, and maybe you have some private functions that do some housekeeping. That's basically it. So let's run that again and see if it works right. No guarantees. All right. Got close. Well, I think you see what happened there. There's a cut and paste there. Hit the right edge. There we go. Cutting and pasting is responsible for most of, a lot of the bugs that you're going to run into. But there he goes. Whee! Look at him go. Is he dropping down? Yeah, he's dropping down. All right. But there you go. There's how to make a class. Let's just kind of recap real fast. To actually make the file, right-click on your project and say Add Class. That will create the file for you. Within your class, put the data that you need and create a constructor. You can do that by typing CTOR and hitting Tab twice, and then make the functions that object needs to have so you can interact with it. And then for those functions, make sure that you are making them public. Let's go to our invader. There we go. Make them public so that outside objects can call those functions and control that object. And that's basically it. All right. So there's a silly little demo. Hopefully that helps explain what a class is, how to create one, and what needs to go in one.